Hello, my name is Odin Hartshorn Halvorsen. In my paper, I delve into Tolkien's work and scholarship about his work to help build an understanding of how writers might learn to use specific techniques to bring our own fantastic landscapes to life. The geography of a constructed world draws upon the skills found within multiple disciplines, from history and anthropology to science and linguistics. Mythology, folktale, and the whole canon of similar fantasy work also play an important role. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien points to this process with his coined term, Cauldron of Story. This is his method of describing how multiple source elements become blended to create something recognizable to the reader, and yet also new. We need to coalesce the essence of all our knowledge and experience within the Cauldron of Story in order to make a map more than just a fun exercise. To fully access the geography of a secondary world, that geography must be completely laid out and composed with significant detail. It must be more than a generic mountain range. It must contain a historical and mythological dimension, as well as the geological dimension. What does that mountain range mean to the people who have always lived in its shadow? How has it informed their growth? How has it informed their development? Once the writer begins to ask themselves questions in this regard, then the depth of the world can open and the plot can begin to take direction from the setting rather than the other way around. Now, Tolkien's original work on Middle-earth began as myth and poetry, with the earliest pieces of what would one day become the Silmarillion. Much of this was actually connected to various geographical areas from his own life. Coined by JRR Tolkien, a secondary world refers to any constructed fictional world which exists as a subcreation of the real world. Now, for Tolkien, subcreation, as well as secondary world, held connections to his religious beliefs. Tolkien believed that the work of an author was, in essence, a lesser repetition of the divine creation, hence the term subcreation. Though related to his concept of religion and the divine, his philosophical position on the meaning of secondary world describes a time of enchantment with a story that I think many of us who read and write fantasy have felt in our own ways. It goes beyond a simple suspension of disbelief. It is a deep and a primal longing for an immersion within the fantastic. Tolkien called this state secondary belief. This is a term that implies a state of enchantment where the governing consciousness is placed automatically on hold, in the same way it might be for a child listening to a fairy story. Tolkien himself notes this, actually, in his essay on fairy stories. He says, anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say the green sun. Many can then imagine or picture it. But that is not enough. What Tolkien does not say here is how the process of deepening the fantasy reality can be achieved. And he does, however, present a model of sorts within the fantasy geography of his own constructed world. Geography which contains both descriptions of a natural environment and of sentient action upon that environment. Geography literally means earth writing. In there, we find a reference to maps created through both drawings and language. In his book of essays, The Practice of the Wild, the poet Gary Snyder points out that a culture in the real world is directly tied to its landscape. This is no different within a constructed world. The topographical elements of the secondary world, the mountains, lakes, rivers, forests, and seas, these will all inform the cultures that inhabit the world and will, therefore, inform the characters through which the narrative unfolds. The physical geography of a person or a society's home surroundings influences them from birth to death, and their subsequent relationship with that geography further creates a continuing cycle of interrelated action and reaction. Ultimately, this means that maps are visual representations of more than topology, more than location. Maps are physical representations of time. Now, Stefan Ekman, in his book Here Be Dragons, makes this point with relation to Tolkien's map of the Shire. See the Old Forest? Now, it's not the only forest in the Shire, but it's the only one with that honorific. It's special. Its very name denotes its unique status. The Old Forest not only gives us a sense of time within the world, it provides us with a sense of what the Hobbits view as old, while simultaneously hinting at their relationship to the natural world. And the Shire's physical depiction on the map says more. Despite that other woodlands do exist, they appear tamed by the roads and settlements which surround them. By contrast, the Old Forest is a border. The Old Forest appears to lean against the eastern edge of the Shire, pressing at it and held at bay by the narrow line marked the hedge. Now, as is learned a little later in the story, the Hobbits do indeed have a relationship with the Old Forest, and an antagonistic one at that, many, many centuries old. Let's contrast Tolkien's map of the Shire to one of a real-world location but drawn in a similar style. Drawn by Alden Olmsted, the following here is a map of Sonoma County in California. On close reflection, we can see topographic elements, pieces of the natural landscape. We can also see places where administrative and natural geography intersect, where the society living here has interacted with or impacted the natural landscape. Notice too how the edges of the map don't delineate an end, but actually actively suggest more knowns. Obviously, this is a map of the real world, but that same technique can be used in a map of a fantasy landscape to create breadth and depth for the reader. Suddenly, a world can exist that's much bigger than the one we see as the reader. And that suggestion of a bigger world makes everything feel more real for the context that it provides. The depth of fictional landscapes is aided by how those landscapes adhere to real-world similarities. The extensive descriptions of landscapes found in some fantasy fiction are not simply an overabundance of descriptive language, but rather a central aspect of what provides depth and reality to that constructed world. As such, geographic construction also implies history. It manages to create, with very little effort, the suggestion of a chronological experience to the constructed world. A map of a fantasy world is not enough, on its own, to create the appearance and tone of depth. It will do little more than exist as part of the novel's metatext, unless the experience of the landscape as described within the map is made into an inherent part of the narrative. Now, as mentioned earlier, Tolkien began by creating his maps, by laying out the foundational geography of what was to become the landscape for his stories. But this gave him bounds for his plot. It created natural geographic boundaries for his world, and also informed the more potent boundary of time. Time is deeply intertwined with geographic elements. The turning of the seasons implies repetitive shifts in local geography. Travel is understood in terms of the landscape through which it is undertaken, and both history and mythology take root in the formations of the natural world, in rock and wood, in mountain and plain, in the passage of the stars overhead. Both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are travel stories based on an archetypal adventure narrative framework. Roughly this: in encountering troubles along the way, the adventurers follow winding roads toward their grand destination. Of course, some periods of travel are condensed through narrative compression. This is when a time in a story is skipped or simplified for the sake of plot, while other moments are described in greater detail. The point is, if the geography already exists in some form, the writer has this freedom to jump ahead and condense without potentially disrupting the realism of the world. This is, indeed, one of the essential factors of secondary belief, for if the writer cannot force the landscape to conform to the needs of the plot, they must instead force their plot to conform to the geography, just as it happens in real life. By laying out the geography of Middle-earth early on, Tolkien forced his work to maintain a sense of internal consistency. He could still fast-forward his geography by utilizing narrative compression, but in so doing, he continued to know exactly how long certain travel would take, and what might be encountered, geographically speaking, along the way. Tolkien actually mentions this in a 1955 letter regarding the curious effect that story has when based on very elaborate and detailed workings of geography, chronology, and language, that so many of his readers should clamor for sheer information or lore. Secondary belief is something that thrives not merely upon a story which is told well, but upon a story which feels real. Reality has a sense of stability to it, and if the stability is unseated without good reason, it can leave the world feeling uncoordinated and artificial, the exact opposite of what is beneficial for the creation of secondary belief. Now, in another letter, Tolkien said regarding a treatment of The Lord of the Rings, a film treatment of The Lord of the Rings, that Rivendell was not a shimmering forest, as the filmmakers would have you believe. He said, "This is an unhappy antecedent of Lorien, which it in no way resembled. It could not be seen from Weathertop. It was 200 miles away and hidden in a ravine. I can see no pictorial or story-making gain in needlessly contracting the geography. For Tolkien, the geography mattered inherently because the whole story was inherently connected to it. The changes to and formations of Middle-earth's landscape over time were both brought around by events within the story and affected the events that came after. When constructing a secondary world, we must start by learning about how things in that world interact. Everything within our constructed world is likely to have some sort of impact on everything else. We may then use that information to both highlight elements of the world and story, and to inform the decisions of the characters who arose from that network of interactions. To briefly help us understand this, let us consider hobbits. Hobbits are a prime and important example of how the geography of a secondary world and the cultures inhabiting it influence one another. When observing the map of the Shire included in The Lord of the Rings, it becomes quickly apparent that it denotes Hobbit control of the landscape, as Ekman points out in Here Be Dragons. The farthing borders on the map, and indeed the very existence of the farthings themselves, suggest a sturdy, centralized social order, a point backed up by elements of an advanced social structure found within the narrative itself, such as the existence of a capable postal service. In their earliest days, hobbits built in their traditional style, burrowing holes into the ground and expanding them into a series of tunnels and rooms. However, as population density increased over centuries, new developments took shape out of necessity. And these new buildings and architectural styles were in the tradition of men, above-ground dwellings built of timber and stone, yet often retaining the hobbit's affinity for organic line and tone. By the time of the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Hobbit society shares many aspects in common with modern real-world society. Mills, inns, quarries, even the structure of their daily lives around various meal times, all hint at a sort of stable social order which is familiar to modern life. This creation of a recognizable and sympathetic culture is important, for it allows the reader to become familiarized with Middle-earth through the eyes of people who are already themselves comfortable, at least within their own realm. The story can then move from this introductory world of the known into the world of the strange. And the reader gets to experience that alongside members of a cast who are themselves experiencing it for the first time. Secondary world building is a process which extends beyond fantasy genre literature and naturally extends into any type of secondary world where the enchantment of the reader is the primary goal of the author. While I go into greater detail in my paper, I believe that it's already possible to see how a strong geographical sense provides continuity for character journeys, and how such creates a sense of depth of time, and how vast implications can be drawn from geographic elements, even things as simple as names. We've learned how characters and societies interact with their geographical space, and how barriers or landmarks in the natural world can become wrapped up in mythology, and how that mythology can inform a character's personality and beliefs. JRR Tolkien provided the world with a new type of fantasy fiction through his lifelong work on his secondary world. He cemented his creation as one of the central pillars of the fantasy genre. The way he did this, through the creation of secondary worlds fostering what he called secondary belief, provides us with an unprecedented template from which to draw further inspiration for our own stories.